Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Good morning. Good morning. I hope you're all enjoying day 2 of Battle of Ideas 2008 and aren't feeling too jaundiced or jaded from the ballet and the drinks last night. I'm Angus Kennedy from the Institute of Ideas, and this session is called Learning Jargonese. Is therapeutic, managerial, techno-speak, corrupting the language of politics today. Just as a way of very quick introduction to the subject and what we mean by this, earlier on in the year, Labour MP John Cruddas attacked the language of New Labour, his own party, for being too managerial and technocratic, for not emotionally connecting. And just this week, Jack Straw followed in a similar theme by sharing his frustration with the idea that we should recognise the crimogenic needs of offenders. And he was fearful that such impenetrable jargon could be becoming a barrier between the public and experts. And I think there's something to explore here, because we've known for a long time that the language of politicians has been quite distancing from their publics, and a number of people have commented on the impenetrability and the tendency for jargon to be used in politics today, which is what we're going to discuss. It's a breakfast banter. It's a short session. We've only got 45 minutes, so we're going to get straight out to the speakers. We're going to give 4 to 5 minute introductions each, and then a quick panel, 4 to 5, not 45, 4 to 5 minute introductions each, and then a quick panel discussion before we go out to the floor for points and questions. So we've got 3 speakers today, and in the order of which they will speak. On my far left, Stephen Poole, who's the author of Unspeak, an excellent guide to contemporary jargon, which is in the Foyle's bookstall, if you'd like to have a look afterwards. He's a book reviewer for The Guardian, he's written for The New Statesman, and he also composes scores for documentaries and short films. Immediately on my left, Professor Bob Eagleston. He's Professor of Contemporary Literature and Thought at Royal Holloway, University of London. He's the editor of Routledge's Critical Thinkers series. He's written on the Holocaust in literature, on Derrida's legacy, on J.M. Coetzee, and he was telling me he was once rude to Vince Cable in the green room before going on air, which gives him a thumbs up in my book. And on my right, Dolan Cummings. He's the research and editorial director at the Institute of Ideas, the editor of the Culture Wars online review, and he's a founding member of the Manifesto Club, who also have a stall today and a campaign to get involved in against booze bans. Dolan writes widely on the role of the public intellectual and on religion and ideology and language in public life. So, without much more introduction, I think if Stephen, you'd like to kick us off on what is jargon?
Okay. Hi. Well, the question is, has language been corrupted by managerial jargon? And it's already happened hundreds of years ago in many senses. For instance, the word commodity used to mean anything that was good, that was commodious, anything that made our lives better. And then, this is an argument of Quentin Skinner's, actually, that I talk about in Unspeak. And then the emerging business class came along and said, we're going to grab that word and use it for the things we want to buy and sell. And so the sense of the word narrowed to become only something you buy and sell. We can no longer use the word commodity to mean something that's just generally good. It's now just an atom in the market. And you can see this happening. In other words, shift used to mean a sense of resourcefulness, which we can still see in the word shiftless, meaning sort of feckless. But then it got grabbed again to mean a kind of a period of time in which you labor for your employer. And I was thinking about another example over this summer, of course, security and securitization. This kind of jargon we've been hearing about, the credit crunch. Well, of course, security used to mean freedom from care, freedom from danger. And the assets that were allegedly securitized by the banks didn't turn out to be very safe after all. Credit crunch, I have an economist friend who says his aunt asked his mother, how's Daniel doing in this credit crumble? I thought that was very nice. And it's funny that while the business language has grabbed all this language of morality and virtue from the language at large, it likes to euphemize what's going on within its own sphere. So you get these treadmills of euphemism crisis then became known as a depression, and then the word depression was turned into recession because it was thought that depression was too frightening. And then people wouldn't say recession anymore, they would say slow down. I think we're finally getting politicians to say recession again. Gordon Brown said it this week. But it's been a long haul. And that kind of euphemism treadmill is very familiar from military language, for example. In the Vietnam War, soldiers that were killed were brought home in body bags. And then in the first Gulf War, that became human remains pouches. And in the current Iraq War, they're now known as transfer tubes. And another thing that happens is that the language of economics tends to infect other spheres. I mean, if you think of language like we were talking about last night, human capital, social capital, that kind of thing, where we are led to think of everything that isn't necessarily economic in an economic fashion. So I consider that a sort of infection of a particular type of jargon into a language which tends to threaten to narrow the senses in which we can use certain words. And on the other hand, of course, it's interesting to note that the language of economics increasingly has a lot of metaphors of violence and war in it. So we've always spoken of captains of industry and corporate raids and price wars and products being launched and employees being fired. And I did actually wonder why this is called the Battle of Ideas. Why can't it be like a dance of ideas or a concert of ideas? I thought that was a bit of a shame. Anyway, back to jargon, which is allegedly the issue at hand. I think we've got to distinguish necessary jargon, which is every field, there's a specialized vocabulary for quantum mechanics or molecular biology or technical aspects of music, which you have to adopt and understand if you want to talk about these things in a lot of detail. And so to dismiss that as jargon, I think, is just to say that you're not really interested in learning what it means. And then there's what I would call a sort of harmless kind of jargon. Last night at a party, we were told that the atrium of Imperial College was designed to enable people to interact and exchange ideas. And I thought, well, what's wrong with just saying it's designed for people to talk to each other in, unless they're interacting in some other way that wasn't specified? So, to conclude, I think jargon is fine when it has a purpose, but when it's used to smuggle in arguments that aren't overtly stated, or to conceal or obfuscate facts, or to conceal the absence of a meaning, then it's something we should fight against. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Robert, would you...
Hi. So Steve's book, Unspeak, is full of really good examples of contemporary jargon, from intelligent design to peace wall to extraordinary rendition, and examples of commodity and security and credit crumble are also, commodities obviously a long one, but jargon's been a problem for a long, long time. Socrates began doing philosophy precisely... Did you hear any of that? Yeah, okay. Socrates began doing philosophy precisely because the sophists used jargon and rhetoric to convince people, and he wanted to find the truth. So if a problem's been around that long, 2,500 years, and no one's really solved it, it's not really a straightforward problem, okay? It's something inextricable, something interwoven into the fabric of our cultural and social life. So what I want to do in the next 4 minutes is to defend jargon as a phenomenon that tells us something really important. It's a really important thing. Jargon has its origin in the nature of technical language. If I take my car to the garage and I say to the person, it's broken, and he says, oh yeah, it's the whirly-whirly round thing that mixes fuel and air in your engine that's broken, I'm not going to trust that person. If they say it's the carburettor, I trust them slightly more. I expect them to know what a carburettor is. In this technical language, jargon or specialized language acts a little like one understanding of poetry. If the job of a poem is to draw attention to something otherwise unnamed or unacknowledged, to express the inexpressible, so specialized language aims to bring attention to something hitherto unknown or unexpressed. The top of a door, I was going to point to the door, but there isn't really a door. The top of a door is called a lintel, and when you know it's called a lintel, it suddenly swims into focus, and you can discuss lintels and see how lintels change and develop. And this is how knowledge works. You can't discuss the origin of species differentiation until you see differences in species, until you create jargons to understand that. This also means, of course, that jargon can be quite radical. Betty Friedan, in her 1961 Whodunit, The Feminine Mystique, has to invent all sorts of words to understand this strange ailment that's affecting white middle-class American women. And of course, Marx, too, invented a whole new language, a whole new jargon. So jargon attackers, of course, acknowledge there must be a technical language, necessary jargon, Steve said, but also ask for a simple, plain English to discuss matters of import. But here's the crux of my argument. Famously, Wittgenstein offers a lovely metaphor. He says, our language can be seen as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares, of old and new houses, and of houses with additions from various periods, and this surrounded by a multitude of new boroughs with regular straight streets and uniform houses. What he means is that our language is in fact made up of lots of different languages and ways of talking, with different rules and different vocabularies, different registers, different understandings. And to ask for plain English is to ask everyone, really, to accept that one bit of the city is the real city, the centre, the middle bit, and all the rest just ghettos. It's to deny the complexity and abundance of the world that technical language by its nature reflects. That is, the very plainness of plain, jargon-free English obfuscates. More, and more politically, jargon-free English implicitly enforces and paved with good intentions, the idea that there is a centre, that there's one right language, and so one right way of being. If you can't speak plain English, you're overly technical or evasive or suspicious. And this should worry us, because proper dialogue, proper democracy, means not just talking to people who live in the same bit of town as we do. After all, if we share the same detailed language, the same worldview, there's little need for argument. If everyone were truly, utterly reasonable in an Enlightenment way, we'd never disagree about anything. There'd be little need to talk. The point of Orwell's Newspeak, or plain speak, was to make everyone think the same, to eliminate difference. In fact, and rather counterintuitively, dialogue only takes place in the circumstances where you think it wouldn't, not within a language, but between languages. The very nature of dialogue, the very nature of democracy, then, throws up jargon, unfamiliar terms, specialised language, particularly because to do it, you've got to speak to people who don't speak your language, whether they're specialists in sociology, discussing criminogenic needs of offenders, or tourists from Brazil. And this is a good thing. Rather than rejecting jargon, or harmless or necessary or bad, we need to learn what it means in each case. We need to become attuned to it, to get onto its wavelength. This process of self-education applies as much to scientific jargon, think about how successful DNA is as a term, as well as to political jargon, and it allows us to judge what these words are. So to reject jargon, to reject different languages, is to reject the possibility of dialogue. It's to fence yourself off in one part of the city and proclaim it the only part of the city that matters. What we call jargon is the unavoidable product of the human conversation, and to hate jargon is to hate exactly this conversation.
Thank you both. And Dolan.
Thanks. I think jargon has lots of different uses, and obviously technical language is not the same as jargon, and the technical language makes sense in certain situations. Doctors have to speak a particular language to each other, although they're expected to speak differently to their patients, obviously. The point is whether or not they're communicating, and jargon can be used to communicate in certain contexts, but sometimes it's a way of avoiding communicating, or giving the appearance of communicating while in fact saying nothing. And what interests me in particular is the use of jargon as a source of bogus authority, a way of persuading without convincing. And I think this is a particularly prominent role and problem at a time when the political class is quite apart from the public and doesn't have much of a relationship, has little understanding of what people want, and even less ability to offer anything there. So the idea is to just give the impression of being in control. And I think political jargon does come, is used a lot in that particular way. To take for one example, crime. We've heard about criminogenic factors. There's a lot of jargon associated with crime. The thing that particularly interests me is the idea of antisocial behaviour, which I think is an interesting example because it starts with an idea. It started to become popular around '94 when Tony Blair became Shadow Home Secretary. Or in fact, while he was Shadow Home Secretary and then became leader of the Labour Party. And the Labour Party really stole the issue of crime from the Conservatives. It was always seen as a right-wing Tory issue. And Labour said, no, we're going to claim this as something because it's something people are concerned about. And we need to be seen to be doing something about it. And the idea they had was to recognise that it wasn't just crime, people committing actual crimes that upset people, but general rowdiness, unruly behaviour, and really a lack of control, the sense that the streets were a bit dangerous, that there were groups of young people who seemed to be disorderly. And so they said, well, it's not just about crime, it's also about antisocial behaviour, which is a slightly obscure term that might have been used only by kind of sociologists before then. It was sometimes used as a kind of left-wing euphemism for crime because the left didn't like to talk about crime because it sounds a bit right-wing. But it did have this more general meaning of disorder rather than criminality. So that was the idea. But I think in the desire to be seen to be doing something, it then became simply jargon. It was a phrase that was used by politicians, and they would come up with all sorts of ways they were going to deal with the problem. And so the antisocial behaviour gave birth to the antisocial behaviour order, the ASBO. If you think about antisocial behaviour order, what does that mean? Is it ordering people to commit antisocial behaviour? It doesn't make a lot of intuitive sense. It has this kind of entirely bureaucratic quality, which is why it's been mercifully shortened in most circumstances to ASBO. But it's then something which is, you're not really expected to think about it. It's simply a term that this is what the government does to deal with a problem. Since then, you've had even more bizarre youth offending teams, known as yachts. But youth offending teams. Is that teams of youth who go around offending? Is it a team that goes around offending youth? It's neither of those things, of course. They're supposed to stop young people offending. But it's, it's reminiscent of the American Drug Enforcement Agency. What does that mean? I think the assumption often there is that people aren't really listening, that they just want to hear the kind of reassuring chatter of politicians who seem to know what they're talking about. And it often makes me think of the slightly rare but always enjoyable spectacle of a middle-class couple arguing in public, where what's being said doesn't matter at all, but it's a competition to sound more reasonable than the other one. And it's all done in the cadences of pitch and tone and speed, and it's just a kind of, it is quite balletic in a sense. I think that political language sometimes takes on that, which is a problem because what people are saying ought to matter. Just to come back to Angus's quote from John Cruddas about not making an emotional connection, I think that there's quite an explicit and cynical attempt to make an emotional connection instead of an intellectual connection on the part of politicians, and the language becomes part of that. It was said for a long time by the Democrats in America that they were worried that they were too intellectual, self-flattering kind of self-criticism, and they needed to be like the Republicans and kind of go to the gut and get people where they live and that kind of thing. And I think that in the course of the election campaign, Obama has certainly shown himself not to be overly intellectual and to be quite capable of kind of almost therapy speak. If anyone's seen the 30-minute film that he put out this week, it's low on jargon. There's not a lot of technical political language in there, although there are some kind of folksy idioms and drop Gs, which might be considered a kind of jargon in American politics. But it's very high on emotional tropes. The mother struggling to bring up her family, and the guy who's got an injury and can't get insurance. These kinds of things are a kind of jargon in a way, borrowed from advertising and television drama. And I think that that's becoming the language of politics, which is a kind of more sophisticated jargon. I don't think it's a problem that politicians speak through television, but the particular form of television, the particular tropes that they use matter, and the fact that these are not just not intellectual, but anti-intellectual, all about reassurance rather than convincing or even communicating ideas, I think is a problem. And so that's, I think, what we have to challenge, and perhaps by using television more creatively, but also thinking about language and why the ideas matter.
Okay, thank you very much, Dolan. Just a couple of questions that I want to throw out before we open it up to the floor. Stephen, I mean, the euphemism treadmill that you mentioned, the spin cycle, if you like, why can't we just get off it? Why, when we keep discussing social exclusion, knowing that we mean poverty, why can't we just say poverty?
Well, it does happen sometimes, and I talk about in Unspeak there are certain euphemisms that lose their power and don't get replaced with other things, like the term concentration camp was originally a euphemism for the camps that the British set up in the Boer War, and now everyone knows that concentration camp is a bad thing.
It's not an area for thinking hard in.
Similarly, yeah, and similarly the final solution. Everyone knows what that means. So, I don't know, why can't we just say poverty? I think because there's this kind of technocratic, you have to tick off a checklist of, does this count as poverty? You have to do a whole spreadsheet to say whether it's poverty or not. So if someone goes on the radio and accidentally says poverty, then he's probably going to be attacked by his spin machine later on because he didn't do the spreadsheet first. So I think there's a sense of just being ultra cautious in political language, which tends to mean being extremely vague so as not to be criticized later.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Bob, your point equally about language games, if you like, talking back to Wittgenstein, and again, isn't there not a problem there? Why do we bring in the necessity to have multiple languages when is it not obviously going to be a clearer communication if we try and have a language of politics in which we express what we mean? I mean, democracy is about having a conversation. Why make it more difficult by bringing the need for translation?
Well, because we don't have one language. We live in a multitude of different languages, all coexisting. And the move to try and say, look, there's one language we have to have, and that's the clear language, is to say there's one we have to have which is secretly my language, one particular language. And the worry about saying, oh, well, you know, of course there are technical vocabularies. Well, who decides what's a technical vocabulary and what isn't? You know, so as soon as you start saying, oh, we have a plain language, a straightforward language, you're retreating into one tiny suburb of this centreless, devolved city with these endless languages going on.
How would that work with an example like poverty?
Well, I don't quite see what you mean. How does it work with an example like poverty?
Well, if we're discussing the problems of poverty in society, what more is to be said than that? What other languages do I need to say it in to have the discussion?
Well, but you know as well as I do that that poverty has there are different sorts of indicators, there are different sorts of poverty. As soon as you start to discuss a complex matter like poverty, you automatically introduce all sorts of different languages. The criminogenic term, okay, is an attempt to try and understand all sorts of complicated social matters to do with crime, using all the resources of sociology and criminology. And what made Shaw cross was the fact this term made its way into the public realm and took it out of his control in a way. So, I mean, when you say, well, how does it work with that? The point is, I'm not saying that it should be like this. I'm saying it is like this. There's this constant sort of battle. And if you try and say it's got to be plain, it's got to be clear, you're taking a position in that battle, which is actually rather a conservative and aggressive position, I think.
Can I just come back on that issue of
Sure.
plain English? I think you mentioned the term plain English, and I must say when I hear plain English, I reach for my gun. I hate the notion of plain English, and I don't think in criticising certain sorts of language you then have to be a champion of what people call plain English. I think the plain English campaign gave some bad speaking award to Dolan Rumsfeld in the year when he said that thing about known knowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns, which was perfectly good epistemology. But they said, oh, it's nonsense, because they didn't bother to try to understand it. So
I agree with them.
the kind of jargon that I'm attacking in Unspeak, for example, is something like the intelligent design movement. They call themselves that, and they have all their jargon for the simple reason that they want to teach creationism in schools, but they have to get round the clause which says they're not allowed to teach religion in science classes. So it's entirely dishonest. That's an example of jargon which simply aims to shut down dialogue and shut down debate.
But just to bring in Dolan for a minute, I mean, is there a sense that this language, rather than shutting down debate, kind of speaks more to the absence of debate, an estrangement of the political class, maybe from the people that they should be having a debate with?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I'm quite happy for there to be lots of different languages and registers, as long as they all make sense, at least in their own terms. You don't have to And some of them will be less valuable than others. And I think that one very important language that you might want to have is one for discussing politics. And there has to be some commonality there, even though people are going to be coming from different perspectives. The thing about jargon is that as well as uncommunicating, it can also twist people's meaning. And when we're forced or find ourselves using words because that's the word you use rather than that's what we mean, then the meaning of what we're saying changes as well. So to take poverty and the difficulty of talking about poverty, actually I think the latest word to describe poverty of the poor is the vulnerable groups. And you know, when you economic policy, this will harm the most vulnerable people in society.
Or at risk.
Yeah, at risk. Yes, that's another good one. But think about what you're saying when you replace the word poor with vulnerable, because if someone's poor, there's a problem that they need to be given more money somehow. They need to be made more wealthy. If someone's vulnerable, they need to be protected. They're still poor, but they need to be protected. And I think that emphasizes a shift in political priorities from thinking about a particular way of thinking about society and socioeconomic factors being important to one which is much more therapeutic, really, because when we talk about vulnerable, it's not necessarily about physical violence, but about a kind of emotional well-being, all these kinds of things which are becoming important in politics as well. So it does shift the terrain of discussion. Even for you know, if you wanted to be talking about poverty, you find yourself talking in the terms laid down by politicians.
Sorry, but I cut you off earlier. Did you want to come
Well, I
back?
was just to respond to Steve's point. I'm happy to.
Okay. Just one last thing on the plain old English. I mean, in your introduction, Stephen, you said that maybe we needed to look behind the headlines of these kind of jargon words to stop people smuggling in by deceit, and the smuggling in by deceit was kind of an illegitimate move in the argument. Mm-hmm. Is that not to endorse a form of plain English? I don't mean getting your grammar good, yeah? But I mean that we should be saying what we mean clearly.
I'm really arguing simply for a form of honesty in debate. Yeah, you can't get out of rhetoric. I'm entirely with Stanley Fish on that, you know. But you can get out of dishonesty. You can say instead of...
How can you distinguish between the two? What's the
between rhetoric
and honesty? Isn't that the point of Stanley Fish? There is no meta-language to have the conversation in.
No, there's no meta-language. You can't get outside of rhetoric, but I think you can get outside of dishonesty and just state clearly this is the position I'm arguing for.
Okay, can we tell the difference between lying language, trying to deceive you, and honest language, trying to convince you and win the battle for ideas? Can I see hands? Keep them up, and I'll take points. So this gentleman here, and then here with the green tie. Just Mike, just next to you.
A crucial overarching phenomenon in this debate is the killing of the word problem. It's only the intelligentsia like you who use it. Everyone else now calls problems issues. And the implications of that are to defuse whatever debate there is. Because when you say problem, you imply that somewhere there's a solution and somebody ought to be able to find it. If you talk about issues, it's just a smear on the window pane. And I think there's a very serious problem there. That's not jargon, that is an abuse of language, and I wonder who started it.
Okay. We'll take a few. Sorry. Gentleman here, and then there's a lady down here in my front.
I don't have much problem with individual words. I mean, it's all good sport, knocking individual words. But I think where we have a serious problem in politics is with different languages. And let me quote the example of the Butler Report. The Butler Report was written in Mandarin, English, you know, the language of the senior civil service. That is a perfectly functional language within the civil service. But when used to the public, it's totally misleading. And Butler's report was utterly damning of the government. I mean, make no mistake about it, that's the situation. But it didn't appear so because it was written not in using particular words that you can pick up. It was written in a whole language that most of us don't speak.
Thank you. And it was a lady here. Can I see a show of hands again if you want to speak? Here and then in the middle. Thanks.
I was just going to say that I do agree that language is being corrupted by politics, but I think that's partly to do. I think that's partly to do with our sort of desire to want to be politically correct. That's kind of what I think. And I also want to slightly attack the kind of argument that's been made about, oh yeah, being blunt and why not, maybe not this plain English thing, but there are so many words in the English language, and we only use a fraction of those. So I know you're making a distinction between dishonesty and rhetoric and everything like that, but you have to then think about how you use language anyway, and the fact that it could possibly be the public's fault because we don't take time to look into language and to explore how many words there are just out there, and then we allow ourselves to be abused by the way that politicians use language. And I'd like to pose a question to the panel when you can answer it. Can you make a distinction between jargon and language? Because you seem to be making a distinction, so please make that distinction for all of us here.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman here, can you brief points and I'll bring in the panel.
Yes, the point I'd like to make is that I'm not quite sure what jargon is. If it helps to convey an idea clearly, then surely this is plain English. I mean, we use words like symposium, which if you look at it means a gathering together for immoral purposes. But we all understand how it's used today. Toxin really means something that's smeared on a bow and arrow to increase its killing power, but we all know what it means. On the other hand, when I'm at a meeting and I'm told to address the chair, that doesn't mean anything to me. It's just an abuse of language. And I think we need to change to define exactly what we mean by jargon. It's something, to me, it is something that obscures language rather than helps communication.
Okay, good, thank you. And there was one lady in the white, and then take the panel back in.
Hi, I want to talk about jargon in management. I spend my time teaching MBA students for my sins. And they actually now have a game which is called Buzzword Bingo. And so, if one of your students jumps out and shouts house, that means that you have made the mistake of using all the jargon in one word, and they know it's a game. But it seems to be that the MBA students do use this as a kind of bogus authority. And one of the worst offending companies is IBM. And to give you an example, when they want to ask for a meeting with someone, they say, can we diarise some bandwidth going forward?
Thank you very much. Anybody really questions? Can we define jargon and language better, Bob?
No, there's no difference between jargon and language.
I agree actually with a lot of what Bob said about, I mean, this issue of jargon. Very often people call something jargon when it's just a language game that they don't understand and don't care to try to understand. So I think there is a problem with it. It's a very negative term for something that isn't necessarily negative inherently.
And I also think that the idea that mentioned several times that politics is corrupting our language. I was trying to, I didn't say it very clearly perhaps, but as Stephen's book and indeed his introduction said, this is endemic to the use of language.
Yeah.
So it's not to do with wicked politicians in the last 50 years doing something. It's the very nature of language, because it works with these language games and there's no meta-language to which to do it. There's no central core.
And there was never a golden age when we had a pure, uncorrupted language.
Yeah, except maybe in the Garden of Eden, So, I mean,
no, they were all in their cups in a symposium, I'm afraid.
So it's not corruption, it's just endemic to language, and to object to it is to take up a political position in this sort of debate.
Dolan, is part of the problem lack of the public having the right vocabulary, the right language?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, that's the solution anyway, is for the public to make an effort. And this is not to, I mean, I say this as a member of the public rather than someone talking to the public, but I think we do need to make an effort to use language more creatively and to challenge the kind of jargon that we're bombarded with and forced to speak. Or not forced to speak, that's the whole point, is that it's easy to just kind of pick it up and start to use the kind of same language as politicians. And I think it's worthwhile making an effort not to do that. I think, I mean, just on a technical level, jargon, you could argue all language is jargon. I think we generally recognize it when it's used out of place. So, if you suddenly use a management speak, which might to some extent be useful in management, or certainly medical jargon, for example, has a very obvious and useful role. But when you use it somewhere else, someone who doesn't understand it, that's unhelpful. And when you deliberately do that, that's deliberately unhelpful. The doctor who doesn't want to tell the patient that they're going to die. So I'm sorry I don't have enough medical jargon to do an example, but just gives them a load of waffle. That's a problem, not an issue.
But there are two really good counterexamples. That is. One is to say that very plain, clear speech is also obfuscating. And we soon recognise that. When we say we're tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, that's very plain and clear, but we all know that that becomes what you're describing.
I agree. Plain and clear, it's a jargon.
The second example is, particularly in terms of art and sometimes in terms of politics, we use lots of terms like this literature is very life-enhancing, which sound like they're clear and plain, but actually are also a technical language, a jargon. So the distinction between what's jargon and what's not doesn't stand there.
It's not a technical distinction. It's the way it's used that makes it jargon or not.
Okay, I'm going to throw it out for another round of questions. Maybe the audience can help us clear this up. The gentleman right at the back with his hand up, and the lady then in front of him.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to ask one question. Is jargon unique to the English-speaking nations? Is it something experienced in France and Spain and Germany to the same extent? And if the panel had any comments on that?
Yes, okay. And the lady then in front of him, and then can I see hands again? Here and then here.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I mean, do you really think it's as big a problem as it is? Because I feel a bit uncomfortable about saying we should kind of stop speaking in certain ways or, you know, to ban certain sorts of language. Because I think, we can't. People will use it. It's obviously useful between professionals in a certain field as a shorthand rather than having to explain things in a long-winded way. So I think the issue is more not about, speaking plain English or stopping language, but when we don't understand someone, we should hold them to account and ask them to explain it in a language that we do understand or force them to explain their meaning. And maybe in discussions like we have here or in work groups or whatever, you come to a common agreement about certain terms that you will use. And that seems to me a way forward.
Yeah. So thank you. The gentleman here?
Yes. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Robert talked about Wittgenstein, and I think you should read him again, because what he also said was everything that can be said clear. So this is very funny that you use him to defend some of this kind of language.
Well, sorry, I interrupted there. The question there is what he means by said, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's quite complicated.
Okay.
We can go away and have a philosophy symposium about that.
Okay, and I think it's different between good and bad rhetorics, because there's a line between convincing and decepting, and this is not a clear line, but you can still make the difference between them. And I also think that we are going forward to more decepting language is kind of a problem of the media, an important role of the media that was in the good old days, not the same role as today.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a couple more very brief points and then bring the panel back in to sum up. So there's a gentleman here and then behind him who has the mic already.
It seems to me we must try and escape from a sort of platonic idea that there are absolute things called languages, because we're constantly creating them. And the lady who commented on it being a game has got something there. We've got to learn how to play this game and be aware what use we're being made of and what use we are able to make of the game. Just some words that occur to me: gaze, brights, agnostic, scientist, all fairly recent in the history of languages. Go back a bit further, prevent meaning to get there before, or symposium meaning a drinking party, as has been remarked on before. We've got to be aware of the game. And that, I think, is the real problem.
Okay.
It's created, it is necessary, it's not there to be found, it's for us to create.
Thank you. Gentleman with the mic.
To respond directly to the question, does jargon exist in other languages? Absolutely, it does. And it also exists where foreign languages try and incorporate English jargon words, like the great Czech verb konsultovat, to consult. So there's, you get an awful lot of imports in that way. But I think actually what the main disagreement seems to be is over the quality of jargon we're using. The example from IBM just sounded awful. I mean, this was rubbish. It wasn't good at describing what it was trying to do. It obfuscated and wasn't in any way playful or nice to use. Whereas good jargon, good invention with language, can also be things like street slang, which really do add to the richness of the language. So I think we're actually in many cases discussing the quality of the particular innovations rather than the nature of jargon itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Any final points? I've got room for one more. Gentleman, is that a hand at the back? Yeah, sorry.
just wanted to remind the audience that the so beautiful language of French language or the Italian languages, they all come from Vulgar Latin, which is jargon, the jargon of the old ancient Latins, or Romans, excuse me, and because there were like the cultural Latin of Cato and those guys, and there were the Vulgar Latin, the jargon of the Roman soldiers, and they went through whole Europe, and so the point I want to make is like language is a constant evolving thing, and nobody plans it from the center, there's no central planner, and it's not deliberately made. It is constantly evolving, and it's an evolutionary process, and therefore I agree with the gentleman in the white shirt. I don't remember your name, but
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask our speakers to sum up for 1 minute each. Stephen.
Well, the problem in political language is that there are central planners. There are people like Frank Luntz in the Republican Party in America who writes famous memos to the Republicans saying, remember, you've got to talk about climate change rather than global warming because it sounds less frightening. There are, this is what spin doctors do, and so this is what I'm arguing against in my book, Unspeak. And to take the point about different languages, in French you have the term langue de bois for more or less the same thing I'm talking about, wooden, the kind of obfuscatory, deadening language used by politicians, which isn't trying to start a dialogue, it's trying to shut a dialogue down and kind of make us go to sleep. So all I'm saying, if you want to call that kind of thing jargon, I more or less agree with Robert that we can't really distinguish very clearly between jargon and ordinary language. But I do agree with this point that there are some jargons, some language games that we should resist because they're anti-democratic.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
When I was a little boy, you only heard about DNA when you watched Doctor Who or read 2000 AD. And now everybody knows what DNA is. It's part of our cultural DNA. In fact, we can use it as a metaphor. Okay? There are lots and lots of different languages, and whatever we call them. And I think we should let 1,000 different jargons bloom with the proviso, in this constantly evolving nature of language, okay, with the proviso that we constantly keep ourselves or educated as to what's going on, so we're able to make judgments about the nature of jargon.
Thanks, Robert. Dolan.
I think the problem of jargon is not about particular words or particular registers or sub-languages. It's about the usage of them to mislead and to avoid communicating or to try and persuade people without actually convincing them of anything. And the solution to that is not to police language by banning particular words or having lengthy negotiations about which words we'll use for what, but simply to make an effort to speak creatively and think about how we use language. Which is very different from trying to resort to plain language or objecting to long words. It just means having a bit of good faith when we speak and expecting the same of others.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you all to thank our speakers and the audience for their contributions?